Today we're heading to Taranaki and the highest public hut on the North Island, situated on an old volcanic cone. Let's talk about Syme Hut. Kia ora and welcome to The Tramping Life, a podcast about hiking in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or as we call it here, tramping. I'm Chauncey, and in this episode I'll talk about a specific track or hut. I'll give an overview and share my experience, along with the highlights and some practical advice. One of New Zealand's most iconic and deadly mountains, the 2,518 metre high Mount Taranaki, is a 125,000-year-old volcano which dominates the Taranaki region. The route to Syme Hut begins at the Dawson Falls Visitor Centre on the southeastern side of Taranaki Manga. The lower section is well formed, but the gradient increases as the track ascends through subalpine vegetation towards Hooker Shelter, a key rest point before the terrain steepens further. Above the bushline, the environment changes abruptly. The route continues across open alpine slopes of loose scoria and volcanic rock as it climbs towards Panatahi Fanthams Peak, a secondary volcanic cone attached to Mount Taranaki's southern flank. The ascent from Dawson's Falls to the hut gains approximately 1,000 metres in elevation over around 9 kilometres, making it an 18-kilometre return walk. Typical walking time is around 5 to 6 hours to the hut, depending on fitness and conditions. Syme Hut sits at approximately 1,940 metres above sea level. It has 10 bunks, no heating, it operates on a first-come, first-served basis. The hut's history is central to the character of this route. The original Syme Hut was built in 1930 by members of the Mount Egmont Alpine Club, led by the prominent climber Rod Syme, after whom the hut is named. Materials were prefabricated and carried up the mountain by volunteers, an extraordinary logistical effort at the time. The opening attracted hundreds of people, reflecting both community pride and the growing mountaineering culture around Mount Taranaki. Over the decades, the original hut endured extreme alpine conditions, including heavy snow loading that periodically buried the structure. Eventually, the site proved unsustainable. In 1988, a replacement hut was constructed nearby at a slightly higher and more secure location, although it still gets covered in snow during wintertime. Portions of the 1930 hut have been preserved and are on display at the Dawson Falls Visitor Centre. I stayed at Syme Hut as part of walking the Around the Mount Taranaki circuit in January 2021. Unfortunately, due to severe erosion in places, the full circuit is no longer possible, so the North Island misses out on a classic multi-day tramp. About 5.5 hours after leaving Waiuna Gorge Hut, I made it to the steps that lead in one direction to Syme Hut and the other direction to Dawson's Falls. It was decision time. My plan was to stay at Syme Hut, but I was pretty tired and concerned about the wind and exposure heading up towards the hut. The alternative would have been a longer walk back to my car than an hour driving back to New Plymouth. The downside of leaving the hut at 11:30 a.m. after waiting for morning heavy rain to clear. It gave less options, though sunset wasn't until nearly 9 p.m, the skies are blue and it was surprisingly warm still. While making up my mind, a young woman came down the steps. She'd also planned to stay at Syme Hut, but had bravely, and unusual in my experience of people climbing Mount Taranaki, decided to turn around halfway up the scoria slope and return to her car. The wind, which at 60 kilometres per hour was near gale force, had made her decision. That helped me make up my mind to abandon Syme Hut, but I thought I'd just walk up the scoria slope for a bit for photos and see how much stronger the wind was there than on the steps. Once I got onto the slope, it was pretty full-on, but more constant than gusty, and hiking poles make a huge difference on scoria slopes, and the young woman didn't have any. I also saw a couple of guys ahead of me making their way up towards the hut without appearing to be in too much trouble. It was warm enough, the weather was fine other than the wind, and there were no drop-offs if I got blown over, and I still had time to attempt the hut and turn back if it got too much, so I decided to push on. It was pretty exhausting climbing the slope, but I made better progress than I feared, and it seemed increasingly doable to reach the hut. The sun was still shining, although only just as it was setting on the other side of the mountain. The scoria gave way to more solid rock, which helped that the wind got stronger. It was strongest just over the lip of the climb, with a snow-filled crater to my side, and here crouching and making full use of my poles was required to stay upright. Thankfully, Syme Hut was just around the corner. I was very grateful to finally escape the wind and have my first rest of more than a couple of minutes in nearly 7 hours of hard tramping. At the hut were the guys I was seeing heading up the hill, enjoying a beer. There were locals who just walked up to the hut for some Sunday evening exercise and headed back down to Dawson's Falls after we talked for about 10 minutes, which left the hut to myself, quite the contrast to the 14 people who'd stayed in the 10-bunk hut the previous night, according to the group I'd passed earlier on. It's a relatively small 10-bunk hut anyway, so to have 14 people in there would have been quite a squeeze. The hut is firmly held down with cables that hummed and buzzed in the wind, sounding like a fly. The toilet was a sturdy concrete cylinder with expansive views, with the door open, safe enough as the only person on the mountain that evening. In the opposite direction to the sunset, I could see Mount Ruapehu 250 kilometres away. It was such a clear evening looking out across the North Island. For a couple of minutes, Mount Taranaki was lit up red by the setting sun. I've seen a lot of sunsets, but this was up there with the best, and I ran around the empty hut taking photos from every angle. The mountainside and the hut had quite a different atmosphere lit by moonlight. I didn't sleep too well as the gale force wind continued through the night when it had been forecast to drop, and I was a little anxious about getting back down safely the next day. I was woken by an impressive sunrise though, and Mount Ruapehu looked quite different in the morning, rising above a layer of cloud. In the morning I could also see its neighbours Mount Tongariro and Mount Narahuri. After breakfast I headed back down the hill, which wasn't that much faster than going up, as I was taking it carefully given that the strong winds were behind me rather than in front of me, making balancing on the steep slope tricky. I didn't really get to enjoy the epic views as I was concentrating hard on getting down safely. It was a great relief to reach the steps. From here it was endlessly downhill for another hour or so with little of note until I reached the Dawson Falls Visitor Centre. In terms of highlights, Syme Hut is possibly the most spectacular place I have ever stayed, helped by seeing an incredible sunset and sunrise. The tramp to it takes you from thick bush to the top of a volcanic cone and all terrain in between. On a clear day, you can see a substantial part of the North Island below you. It's quite a feeling. The views you get are as good as from the summit of Mount Taranaki, but with far fewer people and presumably marginally less effort as it isn't quite as high. The historical significance also adds depth to the experience. The hut is far more basic than many huts these days, but it has character and a sense of history. To finish with some practical advice, this is a physically demanding alpine tramp with significant elevation gain. A high level of fitness is required. The upper sections are exposed to wind, snow and ice, even outside of winter. In colder months, mountaineering equipment and appropriate experience is essential. Multiple people have died in this area and many others injured, so be sensible about the conditions, your equipment and your experience. There are limited water sources above the bush line, aside from the hut's rainwater tank, so carrying enough water with you is important. The hut is first come, first served and unbookable. Arriving early increases the likelihood of securing a bunk, as does visiting during the week. Hiking poles are highly recommended. They make a big difference in windy conditions and with the descent on loose terrain. Gaiters may also be useful on the scree sections. Finally, weather conditions on Mount Taranaki can change rapidly. The upper slopes offer no shelter once above the bushline. Always check the latest conditions at the visitor centre before departing and be prepared to turn back if necessary. Thank you so much for listening to The Tramping Life. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow the podcast in whatever app you use. Tell a friend about it and consider leaving a rating or a review. It really helps more people discover the show. If you have any questions or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me an email at thetrampinglife, one word, @gmail.com.